The Prime Minister is calling for all of us to be more intolerant of intolerance, and guidelines are now in place requiring schools to play a larger role in the battle against radicalisation of young people. But the measures under the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act are dividing opinion among teachers and pupils. Some fear the move will turn teachers into spies and close down debate in the classroom. Others see the new rules as safeguarding rather than surveillance. Ghazi Khan is a teacher from Coventry. We asked him what he thought of the new measures.
The current recommendations from the government won't stop radicalisation or extremism. Is because young people have to be understood and tolerated, and I think it's far too broad. A teacher will look at an individual and something that they say that they feel might be extreme or controversial, another teacher that knows that individual will be able to understand there's a specific family background with that child, and that's the reason why they're saying things. So it's very, very ambiguous, I think. A lot of things that are said can be construed as terrible or evil or hateful, but when it comes to young people, the things that they say might be taken from popular culture, it might be taken from a song, and identifying them as extremists as a result, it seems ludicrous to me. Identifying what is an extremist view and what is somebody developing themselves really is a very, very difficult task. If there's a tag of it, a potential extremist that's going to be put on a child, they may not come forth and discuss what they feel, and as a teacher you subsequently won't be able to guide them towards the right decision or guide them towards the right viewpoint. So it is inhibiting, I think, yeah. Are there the people in school who are well-versed and well-trained enough to deal with and spot the signs of extremism? Within the education sector myself, I personally don't think that that's the case. Is there enough training happening? Is there enough of an understanding as to why it takes place? I don't think so. There'll be certain people that say, well, what is the alternative to this proposed government policy? I think it's so important that you maintain channels of communication. I think the main issue that people are finding from all different facets of teaching is that this new framework actually limits that communication. Unless you allow a young person not to feel that they are being demonised, marginalised, and they're an individual that's extreme, how can you really ever have effective communication and subsequently try to solve the problem?
Our thanks to Ghazi Khan, who's a teacher from Coventry. Let's discuss this. Joining our panel this morning, the Associate Director of the Henry Jackson Society, journalist and commentator Douglas Murray. Welcome to the programme. And of course, you can continue to text, call, email and use social media to tell us what you think. Tommy will be letting us know later in the show. Douglas, you heard there Ghazi Khan saying the problem with trying to combat extremism is that actually the term itself is fairly ambiguous. How would you define it?
It's not ambiguous in the government's definition, which is very clear now. The government defines extremism as opposition to fundamental British values, such as the rule of law, democracy, liberal values, and indeed tolerance of other people's faiths. That's what the government guidelines now set out. It's a pretty good working definition of what I think most of us would agree that extremism constitutes. And what's more, the government expresses the view that this is an extremism which it is on the lookout for, as it were, wherever it may come from, albeit there are very specific things at the moment.
Do you agree, Myriam? Is extremism something that's easy to define, easy to spot, and anyone can do it and alert authorities if need be?
Well, evidently not, because this government has struggled to pin down the definition of extremism throughout its time in power, so it's obviously not that clear. And I would actually argue that the current definition isn't that clear either. I mean, British values is a nebulous term, and what's constituted British values has evolved quite significantly over time. But
David Cameron says they are of peace, democracy, tolerance and freedom. Those are our values.
Yes, and I think Nicky Morgan was on a show recently saying that one of the values that would be considered extreme is homophobia, having been somebody who voted twice against gay marriage. I mean, there are lots of people who might get caught up in this definition of extremism who might not otherwise be considered to be extreme. And that's where I would say that I'm not actually sure that the government should be on the hunt for extremists. There are extremes in all societies. They're called the fringes, and we have to monitor them. But what the government should be focusing on is violence and terrorism. And what we need, therefore, is good cooperation between the communities so that they're not branded extreme and so that sufficient intelligence can be garnered to identify the threat of violence. That's where the objective should be.
Bishop Michael, just want to pick up on your first point that you made, Myriam, about Nicky Morgan saying homophobia may be a sign of extremism.
Well, yes, I mean, when the Prime
that?
Minister says to be intolerant of intolerance, I mean, that itself is intolerant. You know, what we don't want is a kind of liberal totalitarianism. I mean, that's no better than any other kind of totalitarianism. And yes, I agree with Myriam. I think extremism can be of many different kinds. What we should be concerned about is ideological extremism that leads to violence or to unjust discrimination against persons in the public place or in their employment or whatever. I think that is what we ought to be looking for. Otherwise, what we are doing, we are in danger of doing, is bringing up children not to value free speech and free thought, and that would be very sad for society.
Well, let's have a look at that. I mean,
I think it'd be more than sad. I think it's dangerous for
Tragic,
society.
perhaps, yes.
What, dangerous for teachers to effectively become spies in the classroom?
Dangerous for debate to be squashed, because it's about what happens with behaviour. So if I'm frightened of speaking my mind and being challenged, then I'm going to shut up.
Yes.
And the most important thing is I say something absolutely wrong, absolutely ridiculous, and you say no. And as your teacher, you challenge me. Now, if I think that what I say, which is borderline, or we have what with kids we call a moratorium. It means that you can play out a whole load of views, and you don't actually have to do them. It's like role play. So teachers are there to enable pupils to role play. If they can't role play, they will take their frustration somewhere else.
But this kind of thinking is not limited to children, is it? I mean, this is going to overflow into wider society.
Of course, but it's the schools which has been the focus this week. Will it close down debate? And if it does, is that quite dangerous?
I don't think so. Look, it's worth remembering what this is and what it isn't. This is not putting the totality of the government's counter-terrorism policy responsibility on the shoulders of teachers. It really is not. What the government is doing, and this is just a part of it, is they are trying to find a cross-departmental policy towards extremism. Obviously the case of, among others, the girls from Bethnal Green who went to join ISIS earlier this year is an example and a demonstration of the fact that it's a real concern and that it obviously includes an element of responsibility within the teaching profession. But this is not, as I say, only the teaching profession. It's about, and the whole government counter-terrorism, counter-extremism policy is about all sorts of parts of society. The Charity Commission, for instance, being given the powers to more rigorously pursue those organisations which use British charity law to help extremism. Another example, Ofcom, channels which often in foreign languages broadcast into the UK extremist material. This is just one part of it.
How very British. Let's shut down channels that we think express illiberal views.
No, hang on, Myriam, that's quite wrong.
Just let Myriam wait. Just let Myriam make her point.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on the Bethnal Green example, which actually is a very poor example because the girls, for all intents and purposes, appear to have been radicalised in their bedrooms online. There's no evidence that they were radicalised within their schools. But I think it's really important for us to think carefully about what we want our schools to do. That is, what kind of spaces do we want schools to be? Are there spaces of trust between the community, educators and children? Or do we want to turn them into an extension of a government spy? And that's a problem. Yeah.
What is good about this is the multi-layered. It's saying all sectors of society are responsible for all sectors of society. So let's look at schools, let's look at community centres and say, what are we doing? So I like the fact that the government is not just looking at one area, but is saying we are all affected by what's happening. We will all be affected by what's happening. The level of detail and the level of how much someone is felt that they have to be silenced, or about the internet filters as well, which is one of the issues. How on earth are you going to do that effectively? Those are questions. But the idea that we are all responsible for each other is linked to donation of organs and is linked to this.
Just very quickly, I must come back on two points that Myriam made. The first is you really shouldn't portray the shutting down of extremist hate preachers who preach terrorism, preach hatred of British society, and say that being shut down is stopping free speech. It really is not.
Well,
there are laws on incitement in this country, and they should exist on the airwaves as well as elsewhere. And if you call for incitement, if you're an incitement preacher, then that is something that should concern Ofcom and concern this country. Secondly, on the case
but
of
is
the
it just
Bethnal
hate? Sorry, Douglas. May I just ask? Are you talking about? I mean, hate is a sort of rather vague term. Are you talking about violence and discrimination?
That's
because international law forbids that, of course.
Right.
Yes.
There are already
Absolutely, but
laws
it is
in
something
place.
which, in recent years, many examples of that going on the airways. But just quickly, also on the Bethnal Green case, this isn't about whether or not they were radicalised at school or at home. The point about this is, can you help teachers look for the signs of radicalisation that these girls at Bethnal Green School would arguably have shown? Now, I have to stress, this is not, again, only about teachers. It's very hard if often a parent doesn't even notice their child is being radicalised, or a husband, as we saw recently of the women who recently went, doesn't notice it or says they don't notice it. But it is incumbent, I think, and possible that you could prevent some of these cases by at least arming teachers with the knowledge of what to look out for. And that's all this is.
Okay.
It is not spying. It is doing everything that everybody else can do as well.
I'd like to bring in Mavis Hyman. In a sec, we'll be back with you. I'd like to bring in Mavis Hyman. Mavis's daughter, Myriam, lost her life in the 7/7 bombings. Welcome to the programme. Thank you very much for joining us at what must be quite a difficult time for you. And I know you have a lot of interest in combating extremism at schools. I just want to ask you first, though, how are you remembering your daughter 10 years on? Just tell us a little bit about what she was like.
She was a very caring person. She was very concerned about the welfare of the people around her, of all creatures around her. And I think that she would have been very satisfied with what we are trying to do, which is a constructive approach to life. And we are starting our journey through children in schools. We are starting with children in secondary schools, but we do hope to extend our program to children who are still in primary school.
And how are you doing that, Mavis?
Well, what we are trying to do is to provide prevention from all forms of terrorism, all forms of extremism. And we are aiming to do this by introducing a program of work which is not only within the national curriculum of the whole of the UK, but is also an extension of the ideas that are fixed on simply academic learning. We go beyond academic learning, and we go into spheres of preparing children for life skills. We hope to give them life skills.
Yes, but Mavis, what specifically does the programme do to try to combat extremism? When you're talking to children about their life skills, how do you bring those thoughts in so that they don't become radicalised?
Well, we hope to create a constructive mindset. That is, there is nothing political in our program, there is nothing religious in our program, there is nothing negative in our program. We concentrate only on the positive. So we feel that if we can create a constructive mindset in young people, that they will be aware that they should be thinking in a way which is constructive. And they do this first by learning to listen carefully, to listen with discrimination, to be able to process what they think independently, that they should be able to therefore act rationally. And I think that the other parts of the program have really to do with intercultural awareness. That is, we give the young people opportunities to be able to experience a different culture.
Okay. Yes. All right. Many thanks, Mavis, for that, and how extremism is being tackled there in schools, primary schools, with a very positive attitude and much more understanding about other people's cultures. Let's find out from Tommy what you're saying at home about all this. Tommy?
Thank you, Sian. Yes, lots of people getting in touch. Let's hear from Daniel on our Facebook page, who says, it's about time parents stepped up and stopped passing the buck. It's got nothing to do with schools unless they're religious schools. Barbara saying, I think it's disgraceful that teachers are asked to be the eyes and ears of Big Brother. Their job is to educate children and not to police them. So questioning what kind of role the schools really play in this. Vicky on Facebook says, surely the cure is for us to all have more tolerance, not less. And Marion in Tunbridge Wells says we need to clamp down on the mosques that are promoting extremism rather than schools. And Naz on the text saying extremism is not simple, kind of a point that Guzzi was making earlier on. It's not extremism is not simple to define, and in particular, putting this into practice in schools is doomed to fail.
All right, Tommy, thank you very much. Bishop Michael, what about that point that said we should be focusing on the mosque rather than the school, that we're actually looking in the wrong place for extremism?
Well, I think there are several different aspects to this. There's the international dimension. I mean, if we were not producing conditions in, say, a country like Syria that promoted radicalization, some of the problems that have been mentioned on this program would not exist. I mean, we've destroyed a perfectly good country and created problems for ourselves. So that has to be kept in mind. Then there's cyberspace. I mean, this cannot be underestimated. People are picking up these ideas not from the classroom, not in the mosque, but they are picking them up from the internet. Of course, the government's own policies in the past, coming back home, have encouraged isolation of communities. The communities themselves may have desired it, but the government has also helped with housing, schooling, community centres that all catered for isolation rather than integration.
So your view is that it has to be, as Douglas and Rabbi Laura was saying earlier, it has to be across the board. It's not one thing. If you're going to tackle this, it has to be internet, schools, mosques, everywhere.
Yes, it has to be across the board, but at the same time, we must not give up things like freedom of thought and speech.
Without stifling debate. Yeah. Quite a tricky thing. Douglas, we'll be back to you in a sec.